Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a really fascinating plunge into some early Christian writings you might not know as well, the Apocryphal Gospels. And we're using Apocryphal Gospels, texts and translations by Bart Ehrman and Zlatko Play as our guide. It's quite the volume.
It really is. And our mission, for you listening, is to maybe uncover some surprising things about what early Christians believed, you know, and how this whole idea of a gospel story even developed.
Yeah, think of it as a shortcut, maybe, getting you beyond the familiar stuff in the New Testament.
Exactly. A way to understand a pretty complex area without getting totally bogged down.
And this book, it's comprehensive. We're talking over 40 different texts, fragments, some dating well past the early centuries, even into the Middle Ages.
And the key thing, the really valuable part, is they give you the original languages, Greek, Latin, Coptic, right there, side by side with New English translation.
Which is huge.
It is. So this deep dive, it should really open up, the sheer diversity of views on Jesus and the early church. You might have some real aha moments with stories and ideas that are completely new.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Ehrman and Plish, this massive book. What were they actually trying to do? What was the main goal?
Well, their main aim was pretty ambitious, actually, though it sounds simple. They wanted to create the first big collection that put the original languages and facing page English translations together for, serious study.
So for scholars, mainly. Graduate students.
Primarily, yeah. That was the target audience. But the point is, before this, trying to get a handle on all these different gospels in the original tongues, it was a real headache even for experts. This was meant to be the one-stop shop.
Right. But it's not just about dusty old texts for academics, is it? I mean, what's the broader value here?
Oh, definitely not. I mean, while academics were the immediate focus, the bigger motivation was just making these really important historical documents accessible again.
Accessible again. So there were older collections.
Yeah, there were. Most famously by a guy named Tischendorf back in the 19th century. Groundbreaking stuff for its time.
Okay.
But, a lot more texts have popped up since then. And good modern translations of even the stuff Tischendorf had were sometimes hard to find all in one place.
Gotcha. So they were updating things, consolidating.
Exactly. Making it much easier for anyone interested to get a clearer, more complete view of all these different gospel traditions.
It sounds like they had a really clear idea of what belonged in the book. How did they decide what made the cut? What were the rules?
They aimed for, pretty much everything within certain limits. The main thing was including nearly all the known apocryphal gospels originally written in Greek, Latin, or Coptic.
Those main early languages.
Right. And they stretched that time frame, even into the Middle Ages, for some texts they felt were really key to understanding how these traditions kept developing. So yeah, end result. Over 40 different pieces.
40. That's a lot to track. Were there any big ones they deliberately left out?
Yeah, and it's interesting why. They mostly skip texts that are already super easy to find in modern books, like the stuff in the Nag Hammadi library.
Ah, the Gnostic texts.
Right. Since those are fairly accessible, they didn't want to just duplicate efforts. But, and this is really interesting, for understanding their priorities, they made some key exceptions.
Oh, like what?
Well, they absolutely had to include the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary.
Yeah.
Even though, they're technically Nag Hammadi finds, they just saw them as too fundamental to leave out.
Makes sense. They're pretty well known now.
And the Gospel of Judas, too, another big one they included. They also mention holding back on the Coptic Gospel of the Savior.
Why that one?
Because they were waiting for a proper critical edition, a really solid scholarly version to be finished, which shows their commitment to using the best possible sources.
So thorough, but also practical about what's already available. Now, the format itself, how do they actually put it together? You mentioned the facing pages.
Yeah, that's the core of their method and what makes it so useful. Bilingual, facing page. So you open it up, boom. One side has the original Greek, or Latin, or Coptic.
Based on the best scholarly editions they could find?
Exactly. Whatever they judge to be the most reliable version. And then right opposite, a fresh, modern English translation. Line by line, basically.
Wow. So you can really compare, see the choices they made in translating.
Precisely. It makes digging into the nuances much, much easier.
Did they actually create, brand new scholarly editions of all these ancient texts themselves? That sounds like a lifetime's work.
No, they didn't tackle that. They relied on existing critical editions made by other scholars over the years. Sometimes they had to go back to older ones, like Tischendorf's, if nothing newer and better was available.
Okay.
And to keep the focus, They deliberately kept the really dense scholarly footnotes, what they call the textual apparatus, arguing about tiny word differences in manuscripts. Pretty minimal.
So accessible, not just for hyper-specialists.
Right. The priority was getting the core texts and good translations out there together, easily usable.
And did they give readers any help navigating all this, like introductions or background?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Each gospel gets its own little introductory essay. And these aren't just plot summaries.
Right.
They dig into the key historical context, the literary style, any big textual issues, basically giving you the background you need to understand where this text might have come from, who might have read it, what the main scholarly debates are about it.
That's super helpful.
And the translations themselves aim to be accurate, of course, but also, readable for people today. Clear.
Okay, so we've got this massive collection, originals, translations, helpful intros. How on earth did they organize it all? It must have been like herding cats.
Yeah, it's a lot of diverse stuff.
Yeah.
They used a system of broad categories, mostly based on the content, what the gospel's about, and roughly following the timeline of Jesus' life. It gives a pretty helpful structure.
Okay, so what are these main categories?
They're fairly intuitive, actually. They kind of mirror the story flow we know from the New Testament Gospels. First up, you have infancy Gospels.
Stories about baby Jesus, his childhood.
Exactly. Conception, birth, the silent years. Then there's a big category called ministry Gospels.
Okay, so his public life, teaching, miracles.
Right. All that stuff. His interactions with followers, opponents. Then sayings Gospels and agrapha.
Agrapha. What's that?
Agrapha just means unwritten things, but here it refers to isolated sayings attributed to Jesus found outside the main Gospels, scattered in other old writings. And this category also includes collections of sayings, like the Gospel of Thomas.
Got it. And the last category?
That's Passion, Resurrection, and Post-Resurrection Gospels. Pretty self-explanatory. Covers the final days, crucifixion, death, burial, resurrection, and then the appearances afterwards.
Okay, that makes sense. Could you maybe give us an example or two for each category, just to make it more concrete?
Sure. For infancy Gospels, you've got famous ones like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas,
Oh.
not the sayings one, the childhood one, and the Proto-Gospel of James, which is big on Mary's origins. Also the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, some Latin ones, the History Days of the Carpenter.
Okay. And ministry gospels?
Under ministry, they put things like the Jewish Christian Gospels, that's the Nazarians, Ebionites, Hebrews group, the Gospel according to the Egyptians, some interesting fragments like Egerton Papyrus II, and others from Oxyrhynchus, maybe even the Diatessaron, that early gospel harmony.
Right. Sayings.
Sayings Gospels, the big ones of the gospel according to Thomas, obviously, plus those agrapha we mentioned.
Passion, resurrection.
Yeah, for Passion Resurrection, you get the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas, the whole Gospel of Nicodemus complex that includes things like the Acts of Pilate and related letters, the narrative of Joseph of Arimathea, and the really important Gospel according to Mary.
Wow, okay. That really shows the sheer range. So the logic behind grouping them this way, it's mostly content-driven.
Primarily, yeah. What's the main focus? Childhood, ministry, sayings, passion, group them together. But you notice, right, it also kind of tracks the narrative arc of the canonical Gospels.
Yeah, it does. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they cover all those stages.
Exactly. So using these categories implicitly sets up a comparison. You can see how these other texts maybe fill gaps or expand on things or sometimes, really clash with the canonical versions.
So it's a practical way to organize it, using the canon as a sort of reference point?
Pretty much. Though, as you can imagine, some categories end up being broader than others, like ministry Gospels, especially when you're dealing with little scraps and fragments. It's not always a perfect fit.
Okay, let's dive into some of these specific texts now. Get a feel for what Ehrman and Play highlight. Let's start with the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. You mentioned the childhood one. What's the deal with that?
Right. So this one probably pops up in the 2nd century.
Right.
And it clearly taps into this real hunger people had to know more about Jesus' childhood. Those years the main Gospels just skip over.
Makes sense. People were curious.
Totally. But what's really striking, and Ehrman talks about this a lot, is the picture it paints of young Jesus. He's incredibly powerful, like supernaturally gifted from the get-go, but also kind of immature, maybe even dangerous.
Dangerous? How so?
Well, there are stories where he, strikes playmates dead when they annoy him, or withers someone with a curse.
Whoa, okay, that's different.
Yeah. But then he also does amazing things, like making clay birds and bringing them to life. So it's this mix of raw, untamed power and maybe, not quite understanding how to use it yet.
That's a far cry from the gentle Jesus, meek and mild image. How do Ehrman and Plaishi interpret that?
Well, they likely see it as trying to fill that story gap, but also grappling with the idea of Jesus being fully divine, even as a kid. How does that work? Maybe these stories, even the shocking ones, were seen back then as just showing his inherent power.
Demonstrations of divinity, even if unsettling to us.
Possibly. But they definitely contrast it sharply with the canonical silence and point out how different this young Jesus character is from the figure in the New Testament ministry. It's clearly filling the gaps with, well, imaginative storytelling.
So, less history, more theology meets popular imagination.
I think that's a good way to put it. They likely see it more as reflecting later beliefs and stories than giving us actual facts about his childhood.
Okay. Moving on to another really big one, the Gospel of Thomas, the Sayings collection this time. What do Ehrman and Plaishi pull out as key here?
Oh, Thomas is huge for them. They see it as maybe the most important non-canonical find of the last century. Probably written early to mid-2nd century, though some sayings could be older.
Older than the canonical Gospels, even.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
That's part of the debate. And the fact they did include it, even though it's in Nag Hammadi, shows how crucial they think it is. They give you the full Coptic version and the older Greek bits that were found earlier.
So what's the core message or perspective in Thomas?
It's all about these sayings, right? 114 of them. Pretty cryptic, enigmatic stuff attributed to the living Jesus. And the theology is distinct. It's focused on salvation through understanding the hidden meaning of these sayings. It's about achieving inner knowledge, gnosis.
Gnosis, right. That esoteric knowledge idea.
Exactly. So self-discovery, spiritual insight, that's the path to liberation here. Not so much faith in his death and resurrection, like in Paul or the main Gospels. Jesus in Thomas is primarily a revealer of wisdom, of secrets.
Is there a famous saying that captures that?
Yeah, the very first one, basically. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. Pretty direct.
That is a big shift from the usual focus. How does it relate to the Gospels we know? Matthew, Mark, Luke.
That's the million-dollar question. It's super complex. Many sayings in Thomas have parallels in the synoptics, but they're often slightly different, or in a totally different order, or the meaning seems shifted.
And no story, right?
Right. Crucially, no narrative framework at all. No birth, no miracles, no ministry journey, no passion, no resurrection, just sayings. So Ehrman and Play definitely dive into that big scholarly debate. Is Thomas totally independent, maybe reflecting a very early sayings tradition? Or is it somehow borrowing from the written canonical Gospels later on? It's still argued about.
Fascinating. Okay, what about the Gospel of Mary, giving Mary Magdalene a starring role?
Yeah, the Gospel of Mary, also likely 2nd century, and it absolutely elevates Mary Magdalene. She's not just a follower. She's presented as a key disciple, maybe even the foremost one, who gets special private teachings from the risen Christ.
Private teachings? About what?
Deep stuff. The nature of sin, the soul's journey after death, how to overcome the negative cosmic powers. And then she tries to share this wisdom with the male apostles.
And how does that go down?
Not always well. Peter in particular is shown questioning her. Like, did Jesus really reveal this stuff to a woman privately and not to us? Andrew echoes the doubt too.
Wow. So hints of early church politics, power struggles.
Exactly. Ehrman and Play likely analyze it as reflecting real tensions in some early Christian groups. Debates about leadership, about whether revelation continued after Jesus, and yet definitely about the role and authority of women in spiritual matters. It's a very different picture of apostolic dynamics than you get in, say, the book of Acts.
Definitely sounds like it. Okay, let's turn to the Gospel of Peter. What makes that one stand out for Ehrman and Plaishi?
The Gospel of Peter, again, probably 2nd century, we only have a chunk of it, but it's a really vivid, dramatic retelling of the passion and resurrection. Ehrman often says he finds this one particularly interesting.
What's so dramatic about it?
Well, the most famous bit, the thing everyone remembers, is the resurrection scene. It describes the cross itself coming out of the tomb.
The cross, walking.
Walking and talking.
Oh.
Followed by two giant figures, presumably angels, supporting another even bigger figure, presumably Jesus. It's cinematic, almost surreal.
The talking cross? Okay, you don't get that in Matthew.
No, you do not. They'd also likely point out its tendency towards embellishment and maybe some hints of docetism.
Docetism. That's the idea that Jesus only seemed human, right? Didn't really suffer.
Yeah, basically. The text mentions Jesus being silent on the cross, as if having no pain, which some scholars see as leaning in that direction.
So how connected is it to the canonical Gospels? Does it know them?
It definitely seems familiar with the basic story found in the canonicals. but it expands on it hugely, adds these legendary details. There's debate. Is it borrowing directly from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? Or is it drawing on similar traditions independently?
Any other big differences?
Oh, yeah. One huge one is that it pins the blame for the crucifixions squarely on King Herod, not Pilate. Pilate is shown washing his hands of it, basically innocent.
Really? That shifts things significantly.
It does. And the resurrection account itself is just much more elaborate, more visual than the descriptions in the New Testament.
Okay, now for one that's made more recent headlines, the Gospel of Judas. What's the take from Ehrman and Pleshy?
Right, the Gospel of Judas. They identify as not Gnostic text, but probably 2nd century again.
Yeah.
And it offers this just completely radical reinterpretation of Judas Iscariot.
Radical how? He's not the bad guy.
Not at all. In this gospel, Judas is actually Jesus' closest disciple, the only one who truly gets him, who understands his real mission.
So the betrayal.
It wasn't betrayal in the usual sense. It was a necessary act, something Jesus wanted Judas to do. The idea was that by handing Jesus over, Judas was helping him escape his physical body, liberating his divine spirit from the prison of the material world.
Whoa, that's pure Gnosticism, right? The body is bad, spirit is good.
Textbook Gnosticism.
Yeah.
Hating on the material creation, seeing the physical body as a trap. So Judas becomes the hero for facilitating Jesus' escape.
That completely flips the script from the New Testament.
Absolutely. Ehrman and Play would stress this total opposition. It's not just a different detail. It's a fundamentally different understanding of who Jesus was, what his mission was about, and what salvation means. Escape, not atonement.
Incredible. Okay, one last group. The Jewish Christian Gospels. You mentioned Nazareans, Ebionites, Hebrews. What's significant there?
Yeah, these are super interesting, but also frustratingly tricky. We only have them in bits and pieces, quoted by early church fathers like Jerome or Epiphanius.
So we don't have the full texts?
Nope, just fragments, which makes it hard to reconstruct them fully, or even be totally sure how distinct the Gospel of the Nazareans was from the Gospel according to the Hebrews, for example. Scholars debate it.
But what can we tell from the fragments?
We can tell they came from early Christian communities that stayed very close to their Jewish roots, keeping Jewish law and customs. The Gospel of the Ebionites, for instance, seems to have had an adoptionist Christology.
Adoptionist, meaning Jesus wasn't divine from birth?
Right. The idea that he was a human who God adopted as his son, probably at his baptism. And the Ebionites might have also been vegetarians, based on some fragments.
Fascinating. And the Gospel according to the Hebrews?
That one seems to have had unique stories about James, Jesus' brother, playing a more prominent role, and different versions of familiar scenes like the baptism.
Different how?
There's a quote where the voice from heaven says, "You are my beloved son, today I have begotten you." Which sounds a bit like Psalm 2, and again, maybe hints at that adoptionist idea, or at least a different emphasis than the canonical accounts.
So these fragments give us a window into early Christianities that didn't follow the path Paul laid out, the more Gentile-focused path.
Exactly. They show us groups really grappling with how to be followers of Jesus and remain observant Jews. It's a vital glimpse into that non-Pauline, Jewish-rooted part of the early movement.
It's just amazing, the sheer variety in those early centuries. Okay, let's pull back a bit. Looking at all these texts, what do Ehrman and Plays say about how the whole idea of a gospel as a type of writing developed?
Well, they trace that word gospel. Originally, it just meant the good news, the spoken message, right? Either what Jesus himself taught or what the apostles preached about him.
The proclamation.
Right. But over time, it came to mean a specific kind of book. A written story about Jesus' life, his teaching, his death, his resurrection. And pretty early on, those four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, became the standard, the template against which others were measured.
So where do all these other gospels fit into that story? Are they just failed attempts to be like the canonical ones?
Not really, no.
Yeah.
Ehrman and Plage argue there's strong evidence that writing gospels didn't just stop once the canonical four were circulating. People kept writing them. It shows ongoing creativity, adaptation of the genre.
How so? What were they doing differently?
Well, exploring different parts of Jesus' life, like the infancy gospels filling in the childhood.
Yeah.
Or using different forms, like Thomas being just sayings or others being dialogues between Jesus and disciples.
And the Gnostic ones using the format for their own ideas.
Exactly, using the familiar gospel frame to teach very unfamiliar Gnostic doctrines about cosmology and salvation. You also get things like the Diatessaron trying to blend the four canonicals into one super gospel.
But what's the main takeaway? Why does studying these help us understand the genre?
The crucial point Ehrman and Pleshy make is this. Don't just see these as rejects from the canon, or only as potential sources for finding some lost saying of the historical Jesus. Think of them primarily as witnesses to how the message about Jesus was received and understood over time.
Reception history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They show us how all these different Christian groups in different places over centuries heard the stories and teachings about Jesus, and then retold them, adapted them, interpreted them to fit their own beliefs, their own needs, their own questions, their active responses to the Jesus tradition.
So they're part of the ongoing conversation about Jesus in the early church.
Precisely. They showed the gospel message wasn't static, it was dynamic, constantly being reinterpreted and reshaped by different communities.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. What are the big overarching conclusions Ehrman and Pleshy reach after looking at all these diverse texts?
I think the absolute main point, the one they really drive home, is that these apocryphal gospels give us this incredible, undeniable proof of the sheer diversity of early Christianity.
More diverse than we might think just reading the New Testament.
Much more. They reveal a far wider range of beliefs about who Jesus was, what he taught, how salvation worked. A much more complex, multifaceted picture of the early church and its thinking. The very fact that so many different kinds of gospels existed shows how dynamic and, frankly, how contested things were back then.
Contested? Like people were arguing about this stuff.
Absolutely. The development of Christian thought, the process of figuring out which books were authoritative, the canon formation, it wasn't neat and tidy. It was messy, full of debate. These gospels are evidence of those debates.
So they're essential for understanding that history.
Totally essential. Ehrman and Place see them as crucial primary sources. If you want to understand Christian origins properly, you have to grapple with these texts. They show how different groups wrestled with the big questions. Was Jesus human? Divine? Both. How? What did he really come to do? What does it mean to follow him?
And they came up with very different answers.
Very different answers, leading to all these diverse theologies, Gnostic, Jewish, Christian, what would eventually become Proto-Orthodox, and probably others we don't even have good labels for. So their conclusion is that these apocryphal gospels aren't just weird outliers. They're integral to the whole story. They show the theological creativity, the fluidity of tradition. You can't understand early Christianity fully without them.
And their book makes that possible.
Exactly. They stress how vital it is to have these texts accessible with reliable translations in the original so we can get that more complete, more nuanced picture.
Okay, so for you, our listener, the big takeaway from digging into Ehrman and Pleshy's work is pretty clear. The early Christian world was way bigger, way weirder, way more fascinating than just the New Testament books.
It was incredibly diverse. And this collection is like a key, unlocking the door to explore all those other perspectives, those alternative ways people understood Jesus in those first few centuries.
And maybe that leads to a final thought to chew on. How does knowing about all these other gospels change how you think about the early church?
Yeah, or about how the Bible itself came together. What does it really mean that these specific stories and viewpoints ended up in the canon we have today, while others, which were clearly important to some people back then, didn't make the final cut?
Definitely something to ponder. If we've piqued your interest, we really encourage you to explore further. Maybe pick one of these gospels that sounded intriguing and find out more, or just dive into the whole world of early Christian Apocrypha.
There's so much rich material there. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it shed some light on a really vital and often overlooked part of early Christian history.
Thanks for listening.